I'm joined today by Charles Derber, who's a public sociologist and author of the book Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times. Could not be more timely, and I think maybe a good place to start is I'm super interested in this idea of universalizing resistance and activism. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, it is the central idea of the book. And what I mean basically is that, let me give an example. I think after the 60s, we've had three progressive universalizing periods on the left, and Trump is actually a very good example of universalizing on the right. So let me start with an example, and then maybe I can get the concept of it clear to you. So Trump is a universalizer in the following sense. One, he brought together a identity politics, which has to do with America first and being an American and being proud and being great about the lineage of American culture and nationhood, with a class politics, which is sort of his economic nationalism, and arguing that the working class really needed to come together and struggle for its rightful place in the economy, and that meant moving from a global economy run by sort of liberal elites, corporate and otherwise, and become nationalist in all forms. That's so the bringing together, the uniting of different kinds of movements into one kind of disruptive challenge to the overall political and economic system is one key dimension of universalizing resistance. The second is that he came from sort of outside a party. He had been a Democrat, of course, for a long time. And he just kind of parachuted into the Republican Party and linked all these right-wing movements, the evangelicals, the libertarians, gun advocates and so forth, with very strange bedfellows who are corporate elites who often do a lot of harm to working people who became his base. But he was able to sort of, we used to call it a united front. He was able to bring together street movements with a mainstream party and pull them together, that is, universalize them into a coherent force for dramatic systemic disruption and change.
This
So
is
that's what I mean by
this is fascinating in a few ways. I mean, one of them is you mentioned the sort of identity politics that Donald Trump employed. Over the last several years, you've seen, by and large, the right criticize the left for their use of identity politics. And I, as someone who identifies with the left, I've been critical of some particular applications of identity politics. But that doesn't mean that the right doesn't utilize identity politics as well. I mean, I think the alt-right movement, which is critical of left-wing identity politics, is actually really an identity movement sort of at its core. So I think that you're pointing out something which is very interesting, which is it's not that the right doesn't do identity politics. They do it in a different way than the left, at least recently. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. It's really important, actually, that identity politics has been identified with liberals and the left. And but you're right. And I'm writing actually a new book. I mean, much of this book focuses on Trump's identity politics, but because it is very important and not spoken about enough. But in this book, I focus especially on progressive politics. And my argument about universalizing there in this book, Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance, I'm mainly focusing on the whole history and current state of the left, which has, since the late 60s, essentially become a siloed movement. Each part of the movement, and a lot of this is identity movements, mainly race, anti-racist movements, anti-sexist movements, gay right movements, so forth. Very important movements, but fragmented and not brought together, and also disconnected from what used to be, for example, in the New Deal, in the populist period of the Gilded Age back in the 1890s, and in the 60s, that identity politics was tied to a broad anti-systemic, fairly well-coordinated class politics. Historically, the left has been very concerned about economic justice and class struggle and class politics. And ever since the 60s, the left has morphed from, until very recently, until Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election, which we should get to, but from basically the end of the 60s, when white student males who were running, Students for a Democratic Society and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and so forth. There were males, often white, who were in control, and women and people of color recognized that they were being marginalized by these movements and felt they had needed to start their own movements, which have been incredibly powerful.
So let's talk about that in a little more detail before we move on, because you're identifying something that I'm hearing is similar to what I've identified in terms of thinking about identity politics on the left over the last 50 years, which is that the version of identity politics that we've increasingly seen on the left over the last, we could say 5, 8, or 10 years, has been an identity politics where individually we are talking about all important and relevant identity movements, but they've not been universalized in a way that has been as successful in winning elections. And very often I'm criticized when I point to the 60s and the sort of more economic populist message of economic justice. And I will get emails from people who say, David, that's too simplistic. It's not just economic populism or these fragmented identity politics movements, but I'm often criticized for that point of view. Can you talk a little bit more about that shift that you've seen?
That is a really big issue, and the book involves. I've written it, but I've included little interludes from very prominent and important activists, and this has become from Noam Chomsky to people in Black Lives Matter and Ferguson, and this issue you just raised, David, has come up over and over again. Are you, when you talk about universalizing, basically trying to go back to a kind of white male politics which doesn't give enough significance to the importance of race and gender and these things? And I think I've been very clear, and I think these people have collaborated with me. We're getting this book is like a movement because so many different parts of the movement have contributed to it and are helping me bring it out to the world. What I'm arguing is that, one, we need to resurrect an economic justice class politics on the left, because ever since really the new right and Reagan, who really destroyed unions and really crushed the sort of class politics of the left, and then the Clintons coming along in the 90s and basically doing a third way centrist politics, which was basically a decisive repudiation of the New Deal, which really was an economic justice movement. We've seen the left transform into this sort of grab bag collection of fragmented, siloed identity politics. Now, I'm not trying to critique them in the sense of saying they should go away or anything like that. Particularly under Trump, these groups are incredibly vulnerable. They've always been incredibly vulnerable, and we need them, and they've achieved an enormous, important success. But when we disassociate these identity movements on the left from a more unifying class politics, which the identity politics needs a class politics. If you run, for example, you have women who argue to break the glass ceiling, and they're just accepting the idea of not going after the structure of the corporation more broadly, but just getting women like Ms. Sanders at Facebook in her book Leaning In. The idea of feminism, it wasn't a critique of the corporate system at all. It was an argument of women should lean in and embrace capitalism and embrace the whole economic system. Well, that's good for privileged white women, but it's not good for the majority of women who are people of color or working, single moms or working class women who have, and the same is true for blacks, who are being left behind further, even as these identity movements have done very, very important work in breaking through certain kinds of terrible discrimination. So my argument is that we need this universalizing, which will both help and strengthen the identity movements, resurrect the intensity and power of all the periods in American history where economic justice and class politics have been driving forces, where the left has been successful, and also help to build a more unifying message that can connect the left, and this is also a controversial thing, with the Democratic Party, as well as with the movements on the street, much as Trump did. He brought, all these very intense right-wing movements into the Republican Party and basically took it over. So that's really the essence of what I'm arguing for in the book, that it's not an argument against identity politics. I think it's a false thing to sort of say, well, you're either an economic justice movement or these are all intertwined. You can't solve racism and the problems of people of color without dealing with poverty, the nature of our capitalist system, the nature of the war system, and so forth. And I'll give you another example, David.
Well, let's pause there if we can, Charles, just so that I think this is a good place, and then we can pick up the conversation in this exact spot. I'll remind you, we've been speaking with Charles Derber, who's author of the book Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times, and we'll continue our conversation with him in this exact spot. We're continuing our conversation today with Charles Derber, who's a public sociologist and also author of the book Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times. I'd love to talk a little bit to sort of continue the conversation that we paused in part one about where you see the actual next steps for the Democratic Party. And you alluded to this a little bit at the end of part one of the interview, this idea of the progressive movement working within the Democratic Party. And this is actually something of quite a bit of both controversy and significance, because we've seen a very centrist Democratic Party, what I call corporate Democrats, now make up a pretty significant portion of the Democratic Party. And yet, on most issues, we've seen the United States move to the left, whether it's abortion or healthcare or LGBT rights or whatever the case may be. So what do you see as the most effective way for progressives to have their political desires heard and, most importantly, made policy, if that is possible?
Well, this is a really critical and very contentious issue, David, on the left. And I'm not arguing that the left, I think the left needs to be in a constant dance with the Democratic Party. It can't put all its eggs in the party, but it can't, as it has often, and as many people argue, it can't ignore the Democratic Party. In the three historical periods where we've seen universalizing politics on the progressive side, which have really made a difference, the Gilded Age, the populist parties, the New Deal, and in the 60s, there was this dance. I mean, in other words, the movements have penetrated the party. And you see now with, this came out very clearly in 2016 race when in the conflict between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Sanders was kind of a voice of the movement. He saw himself that way. He called himself a, quote, democratic socialist, which was a major contribution because, after that, he first said that in a debate. The most Googled word in America that day was socialism. Mm-hmm. We need a conversation about capitalism and socialism that's not being heard in the mainstream or in the mainstream parties. It's almost traitorous in the mainstream discourse to talk about something wrong with capitalism as a system or something good about democratic socialism. Sanders began to pull the Democratic Party and the whole country in a different direction. This is critically important. We need this conversation. And the movements they're always going to be pushing from the outside to get the party to move more in that direction. But the party will never be enough. But to abandon it is to abandon your ability to ever really get the kind of policy and the kind of transformative change that the movements are looking for. So I think Sanders is a really good example. After 2016, as you know, there is a legacy of Sanders supporters, which is the organization, Our Revolution. It's got their chapters all over the country working on the healthcare issue, working on economic justice and minimum wage issues, and so forth. And there's a struggle going on in the Democratic Party today, which has largely been obscured because there's so much focus on the polarization that Trump has created in the Republican Party. But that was productive in moving the Republican Party along during the campaign, and it's very important for the Democrats now. And so I think that the movements have to play a very strategic game in which and this is happening now, where they're running for local office in towns from Seattle to Brooklyn. I mean, all over the country, you're seeing these really movement-based progressive people penetrating into the Democratic Party, running for office, and so forth. But at the same time, they're what movements always have to be. They're in communities, they're operating globally, online, offline, in the streets, for much more progressive, transformative politics than the Democratic Party, maybe even Bernie Sanders, is prepared to do at this point. So my argument is that you really strongly need to see a kind of universalizing dance between the movements on the streets and the political parties. I want to give you one clear example of this in the United Front idea. In Germany, when fascism came into power, you had a lot of Weimar Germany, which was Germany, the German Republic in the 20s. It had very strong gay, feminist, experimental cultural movements that we would call identity politics today. And it had some fairly strong liberal and left politics, the Social Democratic Party that was running Germany and Weimar for a while, and the kind of insane Communist Party that was very under the influence of Stalin. Well, Hitler came into power because the movements remained separate from the Social Democratic and Socialist parties and remained fragmented from each other. And so you didn't get the united front, whereas the far right, which Hitler was one of many far-right people, began to coordinate with the German aristocracy at the time and create a united front with corporate and aristocratic German elites who had run Germany, before the Weimar Republic. And so it's just, we're in a period that a lot of people recognize is authoritarian, potentially moving in a kind of neo-fascist direction. And that's where these universalizing united resistance forces are very, very important. And they failed in Germany. And I'm very, I've written a lot about fascism in Germany. And so I'm very conscious of this. And this idea of universalizing is partly related to that concern, that unless we have these universalizing movements that bring together both the movements and the political parties and bring the movements together and bring, just coordinate, because, at the heart of this is the recognition that global capitalism is what academics like to call an intersectional system. That is, it reflects a system of, dominant power hierarchies, which are interconnected. Race and capitalism are not the same thing. You can have racism in other economic systems, and capitalism potentially without racism, though it's hard to imagine in America. But they're really intertwined like DNA strands. So
Absolutely.
If you're going to change this system, you need to recognize, and Black feminists, a whole bunch of them, but people who lead Black Lives Matter now and so forth, call themselves socialists. You're seeing in a lot of these movements, in the environmental movement, you're seeing Bill McKibben, who was very insular and siloed when he started a lot of his work on 350.org and the environmental movement, has moved much more to understanding the connection. I wrote a book called Greed to Green earlier, and he blurbed that book because he was beginning to recognize that you couldn't deal with climate change unless you deal with capitalism. The same
And
is true of
Charles, I'm curious, and we have so much to get to, and we actually are starting to sort of run out of time even in the second part. And I had a dozen or so questions. We got a really good answer to one, but there's a couple other things I do want to touch on. You're sort of talking about the sort of positioning of what the left should have in American politics. And I've been pretty critical of Democrats who have run basically on being Republican light in many ways. Can you address that a little bit, and whether it's time to really just be definitively left?
Absolutely. I mean, this started with the Clinton years when the Reagan people came in. They changed, they tried to undermine. Remember, for the 50 years prior to Reagan, 1980, you had a New Deal, I call it regime, a New Deal of American politics, which operated under the system of really an effort to move capitalism as far as possible toward European style, Scandinavian style, justice for workers, and bringing together all kinds of social justice issues that Eleanor Roosevelt, human rights, universalizing human rights, and so forth. Reagan knocked that out, and then the Clintons came along and explicitly said, the Democratic Party is no longer a party of the New Deal. We're not for big government, we're not for social welfare, and so forth. And they did these very incremental changes and moved heavily toward an identity kind of politics, which was stripped of its class sensibilities and awarenesses. This has gone on, and Obama, ironically, in some way maintained this. I think he felt he's a cautious politician. He symbolized, hope and change, but he really continued the Clinton strategy of kind of moving away from this economic justice, system shaking kind of politics toward a more, I call it Bush and Bush light, are the two parties. We don't have a Labor Party. We don't have a real progressive party in the United States like there are in Europe. So I feel, yes, to your question, this is a period, and that's why Sanders and people like Elizabeth Warren, my senator, and so forth, are so important because they represent a new energy within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. A lot of them are the Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus in the party, Indivisible. There's a whole set of new grassroots, younger, millennial people who are going to push the Democratic Party to the left. And this is the moment. And you mentioned, David, the public opinion supports this. Among millennials, more millennials say they are positive toward the idea of democratic socialism. I think they're thinking about Sanders sort of style, and they're negative about capitalism. So if you look at public opinion polls, which I've put into the book just to punctuate this point, there is enormous public support for these progressive positions. The Democrats can win by highlighting these issues, whether they're having to do with medical care for all or Social Security, things which the Republicans are going to be going after, or whether it's unions, minimum wage, the role of money in politics, Citizens United. The public opinion is there for the Democratic Party to really move to the left. But the Democratic Party, since Clinton, has been funded by Wall Street and the big Democratic funders who play an enormous role in where mainstream parties go, have been retarding that, and they found candidates in the Clintons and even in Obama who were sort of reconciled themselves to these traditional limits of the Democrats since Clinton. And this is the moment for change, for transformative change. And we're in a period of emergency, climate change, whether nuclear possibilities in Iran or Korea or whatever. We don't have time to play around and to be incremental about this. I mean, all kinds of change are good, but we need a mainstream party that is going to shake this system up. And I think that's why Sanders, who plays, is the most popular politician in America today, according to Gallup polls. He's got a 60% approval rating in red states as well as blue states. So the Democrats can have a 50-state strategy and win all over the country as long as they bring this kind of universalizing message, including to the Trumpian working class, who is going to be very disenchanted purely on economic grounds with Trump's policies. I mean, they might like his identity politics that we talked about at the beginning, but he's really going to bring jobs that are jobs that we brought to Guatemala or whatever. He may bring back a few jobs, but there's going to be no unions, there's going to be no regulation, no minimum wage, and they're going to be terrible jobs that most of his followers are not going to be wanting doing.
A lot of what we've been talking about from the book Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times. We've been speaking with the book's author, Charles Derber. Thanks so much for talking to us about the book.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it.